state funding for the gap coverage, Medicaid coverage, she was unable to obtain health care insurance and tragically died. Have I summarized the case correctly?
Yeah, but to be specific, the Republicans denied care to her. The Republicans in Tallahassee running the state government denied care to her and to almost a million others just like her, even though the care would have cost the taxpayers in Florida nothing.
So now this is an issue I've struggled with before in other states, where you've had a split on the Republican side, where some Republicans have accepted the money. I believe Chris Christie accepted the money, but basically the law provided federal funding to cover people like Charlene Dill. And there are governors like Governor Scott and other Republicans who have turned it down. And I guess just backtracking to my first question, really, this is what sparked it for me. What rationale is there in the world for turning down money that doesn't cost the government you run anything and that provides something very valuable to nearly a million residents of your own state?
Well, one rationale is, of course, sadism. There might be some of them who actually enjoy the thought that people are denied the care that they need in order to stay healthy or alive.
Now, do you really believe that?
Oh, I mean, look, you may recall during one of the Republican debates in 2012, when the subject came up, the chants from the audience saying, "Let them die, let them die, let them." Do you remember that?
I do,
well,
actually. I forgot.
I think sadism is a fair description of that kind of attitude. But beyond that, they're willing to essentially bite your nose to spite their face. They're willing to put up with any sort of pain as long as it's somebody else's. And I suppose their ideology instructs them that if you can't afford health insurance, you shouldn't get it.
Well, here's the funny
bottom line. That's where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think I'm sure you're right, and you know the psychology better than I do. But here's the thing: the tragic death of young mother, 32 years old, Charlene Dill, who is everything that they pretend to praise in a human being, working 3 jobs, doing everything she can to provide for her children, to get ahead in life. This is like the model of the self-made American that they pretend to admire, but which the rest of us are fighting for, and apparently they're willing to sacrifice.
Well, apparently, in the same way that they feel that undocumented immigrants are undocumented immigrants because they deserve to be, and that the unemployed are unemployed because they deserve to be, apparently they think that the sick are sick because they deserve to be. There's a Republican candidate who actually is the Republican nominee against Jan Schakowsky in the state of Illinois, who says that autism is a result of God's anger over homosexuality. If that's your philosophy, then they probably feel like Charlene Dill got exactly what she deserved somehow, in some bizarre moral sense or lack of sense that they have. But you're absolutely right. A single mother working several jobs, leaving behind 3 orphans, by the way, and one of almost a million people who are being denied health care that would cost the taxpayers of Florida nothing. How can you explain it except to say that the Republicans have been blinded by their own ideology? Every single member of the state legislature in Florida has health coverage. Every single one of them. And yet they voted to deny that health coverage to almost a million other people.
I would only amend your statement, if I might, to say every single member of the Florida legislature has government-paid health care, don't they?
That's exactly right. And in this case, what's happened is that up to this point, the limits on Medicaid have been so low that essentially anybody with any job, as a practical matter, likely was excluded from it. Now, what we've done as part of Obamacare is we've taken those 50 million Americans who don't have coverage, and we've divided them up into groups and tried to deal with each group. For instance, people under the age of 26 now can join their parents' policies. And people who had pre-existing conditions now can join existing health care plans that they couldn't join before. And one of the largest groups that we had that didn't have health coverage was the working poor, people like Charlene, people who worked and still couldn't afford health coverage. So for those people, what we did is we said, there are 15 million of them in the United States, one-third of all the uninsured who are working poor, just couldn't make enough money to pay for any health coverage at all. We said for those people is that we will expand the existing Medicaid program in order to be able to help them. Because of the Supreme Court's decision, in which they said that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was constitutional, but nevertheless said that states could opt out of this part of it without penalty, because of the Supreme Court's decision, it then became lawful for individual states like Florida to say, no, thank you, we don't want $80 billion from the federal government. And by the way, not only are the people who would have benefited from that money in danger, but our economy is in danger as well. Nurses, doctors, hospitals, people who provide any sort of health care, they're not getting that $80 billion that they would have gotten from the federal government to do their jobs and provide services to the uninsured. They're not getting that money. So not only are they hurting the people who need the care, they're hurting everybody who works for a living in Florida.
They're hurting the entire Florida economy, which is a great point. And by the way, the 5 justices who voted to strike down that aspect of the law also have government-paid health insurance, if I'm not mistaken. And here's another thing about that. Many things about this case upset me and made me angry, but here's one of them. Your governor down there in Florida was formerly the head of a company that got a lot of funding out of Medicare, and in fact, the company itself, although not the individual, if I recall correctly, there were some fraud issues there.
He was the CEO of a company that committed the largest Medicare fraud in history. They stole $1 billion from the government.
And so he was not afraid.
That's 1 and 12 zeros.
So he was not afraid to wet his beak, at least indirectly, or somehow manage to profit, at least indirectly, from this activity, which, by the way, was funded by the government, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he made $250 million in personal wealth through sucking on the government's teat.
And yet, somehow, this is something he's doing, to deny this money on behalf of the citizens of the state of Florida.
Well, yes, because his business, up until recently, his business was to own and operate a chain of healthcare clinics, private healthcare clinics, that did not take Medicaid patients. And what he has done since he was elected governor was to initially shut down and zero out the budget for state health clinics, require state employees to get drug tested, which was a tremendous boon for the business he ran, since one of the main services he provided was, in fact, drug testing through his own business, and now to prevent any expansion of Medicaid, to force people into the healthcare chain that he founded and owned and ran.
Well, it reminds me of the Bob Dylan line, he can't help it if he's lucky. So this is, do you run into Rick Scott much?
No, I've seen him only once this year.
Oh, okay. Well, so what can people do? I mean, I think that the case of Charlene Dill crystallizes the hideous hypocrisy. And look, I have my criticisms of the Affordable Care Act. I think it can be improved in certain ways and so on. I think we all do. But I mean, this was one of the good features of the law. Outrageously, my assumption is, in addition to the extreme ideology and psychology that you described, that there are also people like Rick Scott doing it for partisan political advantage, that they just would... is that fair? I mean, is that...
You need to understand that this is not an isolated instance. There was an academic study that showed that in Florida alone, we'd have over 1,000 deaths like Charlene's death every year, as long as this crazy denial of Medicaid continued in effect. 1,000 avoidable deaths every year. Around the country, just in the states where the GOP has decided to prevent the working poor from getting health coverage, the number is over 5,000 every year. And in the country as a whole, before Obamacare went into effect, we had over 40,000 deaths each year because we didn't have these people under health coverage. In fact, if you take two people who are absolutely identical physically, same gender, same age, same smoking habits, same weight, you take two people who are physically identical, one has health coverage, the other one doesn't. In any given year, the one without health coverage is 40% more likely to die. That's what this is all about. In Charlene's case, we can put a face and a name on the death, but those deaths are far more numerous than that.
Right. And I think we're talking about, doing the math in my head, what, 11, 12 people each day dying because of this. So, you've been a great voice on this, but I know people are going to be listening to this and they'll be outraged. And I think the Charlene Dill case humanizes, it puts a human face on this condition of the mass statistics that we're talking about. What can people do?
Well, ultimately, what we have to do is to exercise our right to vote. The reason why any of this is possible is because in some of the previous elections, we had Democrats in large numbers decide not to vote. That's what made it possible for the Republicans to take back the House in 2010. When I lost my seat, now I've got it back, but we're still far short of where we were in the House when I was in Congress before. That's what made it possible for Rick Scott to take over state government at the same time as I had to leave Congress in 2010 and to do what the Republicans have done. Florida is, in fact, the ultimate 50-50 state. We happen to have 500,000 more Democrats than Republicans who are registered in Florida, but the problem is we simply don't see enough Democrats who are voting. So the result of that is that we have 17 Florida congressmen who are Republicans versus 10 who are Democrats. We have a Republican governor. Every statewide official other than Senator Nelson is a Republican, and the Republicans outnumber the Democrats in Tallahassee almost 2-1. So, I mean, a very simple answer is let's vote.
Well, absolutely, and to that end, you've been very strong on the messaging, the distinction between Democrats and Republicans. Do you feel that maybe the party as a whole, or other leaders in the party, could be more blunt and more, for lack of a better word, populist in their messaging, or in some way draw a sharper distinction between the two parties than some folks seem inclined to do?
Yes, I do. And I said back in 2010 that we could not let the American people think that the choice back then was between the crazies and the lazies. The crazies in the Republican Party and
Right.
the lazies in the Democratic Party, who didn't know how to get things done, didn't want to get things done, and basically just wanted to draw a good government salary. And that has been a real problem in the minds of the Democratic constituents now for a long time. We have many Democratic elected officials who seem to accomplish nothing and to stand for nothing. That's a big problem. I think that we're setting an entirely different example. When I tell you that a Democrat passed more amendments in the House of Representatives than any other member of Congress last year, what I'm really telling you is that it's possible to be progressive and to get things done. And that's the standard that we need to hold other Democratic elected officials accountable to.
Well, this is such an important point because, for example, we hear people idealizing, we hear what I would describe, my words, as milquetoast Democrats idealizing the deal making that took place between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. But what they don't talk about is that Tip O'Neill was kind of a firebrand rhetorically himself. You could sit down and cut a deal once you've made it clear where you stand and once you've told the voters where you stand.
And it's also just a losing proposition electorally. You can't beat a Republican by being one. And it's a disgrace to the voters to have to choose between what amounts to two right-wing conservative candidates, one Republican and another one a Democrat in name only.
Well, and since you've helped me understand the psychology behind some of the Republican behavior, maybe you can help me here, because I've speculated about this a lot, but is it, you're much closer to it, is it a kind of people-pleasing psychology? Is it fear of confrontation? Is it ideological, that they really stand more to the center than public opinion? And why do you think so few Democrats are willing to stand up and really take them on these issues?
Well, one of it is the power of money, and dirty money, corporate money, money from lobbyists, greedy money that wants something in return for a campaign contribution. This is an odd thing, but it's true. Of the 435 members of Congress who ran for election and won in 2012, 435 of us, there was only one who got most of his money from small donors. Can you guess who that was?
I can probably guess, but I'll let you tell us.
It was me.
Yeah.
Every other Democrat, as well as every Republican, according to their FEC reports, got most of their contributions from donors who've contributed $200 or more. I was the only one out of all of us who got most of his contributions from small donors. So the money problem, the greed problem, the dirty money problem is now pervasive in both parties. If you spend half of each day or two-thirds of each day calling up rich people and big corporations and asking for money, which is what many Democrats do, then that's bound to have some effect on the work that you do the rest of the time when you're pretending to be a congressman or some other elected official. And it's a real problem. We don't really have government of the people, by the people, and for the people when it's being entirely underwritten. At least people's campaigns are being entirely underwritten by millionaires and billionaires and giant multinational corporations. So that's the fundamental problem that we have. Every elected official in America today has a conflict of interest between his constituents and his donors.
So, this is one of those issues where, of course, I couldn't agree with you more, and yet somehow we have to depend on the very officials who are trapped in this conflict of interest or participating in this conflict of interest, depending on who they are, to change it, which is a situation. So, how do we get a democracy back in circumstances like that?
Well, at the state level, people have to take the initiative through initiatives and through referenda, and they have to provide for public financing of campaigns. It's the only way to reduce, if not eliminate, the conflict of interest that exists. And it makes a huge difference. I mean, the reason why I can be so productive in my office is because thanks to our 100,000 donors who go to the website congressmanwithguts.com and make a $25 or $50 contribution from time to time, I have time to do my work. That makes a huge difference. So the public needs to elect candidates who clearly demonstrate that they can do useful things for the public, not for the lobbyists, not for the corporations, but rather for the public, like we've been doing and like some others have been doing, regardless of where they get their money from. Just because you're paid for it doesn't necessarily mean you're bought. So there's plenty of other good progressives. I'm not the only one. Secondly, we do need to take steps through exercise of the public will to try to minimize the effect of money in politics, and in particular corporate money in politics. The right wing sometimes whines about labor money in politics, but I'll tell you that when a corporate lobbyist walks into my office, they want always that lobbyist wants something for his corporation. When a labor lobbyist walks into my office, he or she almost always wants something that's good for everybody, like an increase in the minimum wage. There's not many union members who make the minimum wage. But notwithstanding that, labor leaders are the strongest proponents in the country right now of an increase in the minimum wage.
Well, probably because they understand the economic studies that say that when you increase the minimum wage, there's a lift effect for people several dollars above it as well.
Well, not only that, they realize that the fundamental problem that we have right now in the country, and this has been true since at least 2008, is a lack of aggregate demand. We have a $15 trillion economy in terms of the goods and services we can produce, and only $14 trillion of demand. Why? Because $1 trillion or more leaks out through Wall Street, through bad trade policies, and so on. And the government does its best to try to make that up through the federal deficit, make up the trade deficit, the lack of lending by Wall Street banks, and so on. The leaks in the economy. We do our best at the federal level with the Republicans constantly trying to hogtie us to make up for that deficit. But the real problem in America today is that the people who have money aren't spending the money. They're making the money, but they're not spending the money. And the result of that is constantly a shortfall in demand that would be met with that much and more by an increase in the minimum wage and other policies that put more money in the hands of people who will spend it and less money in the hands of people who will hoard it.
So we have a kind of catch-22 situation now. We've got to count on selecting in the primary process, I would assume, candidates who are willing for state and federal office who are willing to buck their own system enough to put new rules in place at the same time as we're pushing the kinds of lobbying efforts that lead to things like a minimum wage or other economic measures that are good for a majority of people. You've been very generous with your time with us, and I was wondering if you have time for one or two more questions before we go.
Go ahead.
Well, one of them is, and this gets back to the issue of a lack of representative democracy, but from a different angle, that we have right now a public that feels, according to the polling I've seen, overburdened with military expenses, with military adventures, concerned about the morality of issues like drone warfare. You've been very outspoken writing and speaking on drone warfare. I myself have interviewed human rights activists in Pakistan and Africa and elsewhere in the world. Here's one where I've got to say I'm disturbed and upset by the uniformity of opinion you find in some Republican military circles and some Democratic thought leaders, including some of the young guys on MSNBC. One of them said, well, if you want to declare war on America, you get what you get. Speaking of the deaths at a wedding, which included a 7-year-old girl. So I'm not sure she was declaring war on America. And I guess where I'm going with this is from a different angle. How do we get morality and public opinion into something like the drone debate, the NSA debate, that sort of thing? What's the shell we're trying to penetrate there, and how do we get through it?
Well, just to inform the readers of the background of what you're talking about, we have for years now conducted drone attacks in areas where there's no declared war. And obviously, some of the information I know is classified. I'm not going to tell you any of that. But there's massive public reports about U.S. drone attacks in Pakistan and in Yemen. And in both countries, the claim is made that these drones, these unmanned aerial vehicles, these unmanned airplanes that drop bombs, are attacking people who are known terrorists. And doing so makes it safer than, let's say, putting U.S. pilots at risk of being shot down. Although, generally speaking, these people don't even have running water, so it's hard to see how they could shoot down an F-18. But in any event, the problem with these attacks consistently has been a massive number of innocent casualties. In fact, there are public records now of 200-plus children dying in these attacks. And the cases have been well documented. Robert Greenwald, the film director, recently released a film that documented and interviewed some of the family victims of these attacks, including the wedding that you're describing, which, by the way, has never been explained by our government. The government never explained why it attacked a wedding party. Or, for that matter, a 63-year-old grandmother who was tending her garden about a year ago and was killed in front of 2 of her grandchildren by a drone attack, literally blown to pieces. So, obviously, in many cases, these attacks are going awry. The government has strangely reclassified the term insurgent to now include any adult in the area, including men and women both. So now men and women in a particular area are all called insurgents and therefore somehow legitimate targets. The estimates are typically that at least 20% of the people who actually get killed in these attacks are totally innocent, and possibly more than that. And for what? I mean, seriously, are these villagers actually somehow going to, take over the White House? What is it that these people who live in filth and poverty in rural areas in Yemen and in Pakistan, what is it that they are going to do to harm us? What is within their capability to do to harm us? That these are people who have difficulty, finding clean water and have no sewage, barely survive mouth-to-mouth living. These are people who think that modern technology is a cigarette lighter. Right. And then somehow they represent somehow a threat to the United States. So that's what the war is all about. Now, as you point out, both Democrats and Republicans vehemently defend the drone attacks because they say that they keep U.S. pilots from being at risk. The much more fundamental question is, does it make us any safer? And the answer simply is no. Not only do they not actually remove any actual threats to the United States or to U.S. citizens, but they massively inflame the entire local population. There are public opinion polls in Pakistan. Just since these drone attacks began a few years ago, we have gone from the most liked foreign country in Pakistan to the least liked foreign country in Pakistan. We actually rate lower now than Iran and Afghanistan in the minds of Pakistanis. We've gone from the most liked to the least liked. And that's bound to have effects on our ability to actually to take efforts to preserve our national security and to protect ourselves. If we can't get the cooperation of the Pakistani people, we're not going to be able to get the cooperation of the Pakistani government or the Pakistani army. And that actually will have an effect on our ability over time to maintain our safety and to maintain our security interests in the region. So we are alienating millions for the benefit of killing dozens.
But what are we up against? I mean, this is common sense. And by the way, I don't have any classified information, but the Pakistanis seem to know when they get killed. So that's another way to find out, or the Yemenis. What are we up against here that we can't get? First of all, the common sense national security argument. An entire people, you create more enemies than you kill. But secondly, that look, even on a financial level, these drones aren't cheap. It's an expensive war that's counterproductive. Why? What is it? Is it the classic military-industrial complex? Is it the defense lobby and all of that we can't get at least Democratic Party spokespeople speaking up against this? That it has to be you and then Rand Paul? I mean, what are we fighting here?
The boys love their toys.
Okay.
We spend $50 billion a year on spying on ourselves through the NSA, which you alluded to earlier. We spend massive amounts of money trying to develop drone warfare so that people can kill on the basis of what they see on a computer screen rather than killing by looking out the window. And somehow that's considered to be a marvelous technological advance. The fact is that death is death, no matter how it's accomplished. And none of this makes us any safer. A former ambassador in the area, former U.S. ambassador in the Middle East, said recently that for every one that we kill, we create 50 new enemies. That sounds about right to me.
But in the meantime, they get their toys and they get to sit around in the Situation Room in the White House and pick their kill list for this week, I guess. So I tell you, to me, it sounds like a hell of a trade-off, a Faustian bargain at best. But anyway, Representative Alan Grayson, there's so much more I could ask you, but we've taken up a lot of your time. I hope you'll come back sometime. But thanks so much for coming and speaking with us on the Zero Hour.
Good. Thanks a lot for keeping your audience well informed. As you point out, these days it's very, very hard for people to hear the truth. It's just hard to hear. It's hard to get.
Yeah.
And you've done an excellent job of informing people about what's really going on. So God bless you for that.
Well, thank you, and same to you.
Thank you, too.